morning.
All right, let's get started. Or if it's not started, let's continue on. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. So we're continuing on with the meeting that we started last week. And Nori is joining us. And so I wanted to just take a pause in our conversation to explain to Nori what we've been up to, and then also
Madam Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt for a second.
Yes,
I just noticed. So we are actually back in the red zone,
the red zone.
meaning that everyone has to wear a mask for a public meeting.
And
now.
everyone was supposed to sign in this morning.
Yeah.
Wow,
So if you don't
that's-
have one, I have extras for you. But this was the ordinance that the City Council approved a little while back, that when we get to that medium or high tier, everybody has to wear a mask in a public meeting.
And that
So-
happened today, or yesterday, or?
No, I mean, it's been that way since we posted the agenda for the Planning Commission, so at least a week.
Oh, I didn't
But yeah, when
realize.
this agenda went out too.
Well, but you're okay.
I usually wear it.
It's okay, you want one, Don? Yeah, it's okay, I'll get you one.
Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, Dawn, sorry, Dawn.
Okay, Nori and Neil, you don't have to wear masks. So I thought we would interrupt our conversation that we were in the middle of, just to catch Nori up, tell him what we were doing when he was not in the room, and then have him and staff or whoever else sort of comment or weigh in on that before we continue on. Marianne has to leave fairly quickly, so the other part of my plan is to have her be able to speak as much as possible and sort of weigh it her direction for the beginning of this. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes? Okay, I see some nods.
All nods.
So, Nori, I don't see you, and I don't know if I can see you. Oh, there.
There
now we
you
see
are.
you. Hi,
morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
How are you feeling?
Better, but you will still hear me coughing. This RSV does hang on, as you all, I'm sure, have heard.
Oh, boy. Well, we are very grateful that we had your outline, Nori, from last time, and decided to, instead of doing what we did with the strategy paper and sort of going page by page, we decided to sort of treat it like an outline that it is, and think about the structure of it a little bit. And we looked at the structure of the current guidelines, which are the sort of chapter headings, and then we looked at the page 9 sort of principles that you had laid out, many of which have lots of crossover with the chapter headings from 20 years ago. And we're a very responsive effort on everybody's part to convert concepts into sentences. So as we've all discussed many times, we can maybe find something memorable about the principles and have them in people's minds, because we have one of our, I think, I'll ask if folks agree with me, but I'm trying to summarize, I think, the general impressions of the steering committee and possibly the public, that while we have fantastic guidelines, they're not getting used. It doesn't matter how great they are, they're not getting used enough. They're not in people's minds enough. So we're trying to figure out how to find catchy ways to get the principles sort of embedded in people's minds, filtering throughout all the documents that are relevant, checklists, whatever ends up happening in the end. And so we got about halfway through that, sort of comparing the content of the existing guidelines with phrasing things in terms of sentences, principles that people could post on their wall, could be given out at the desk, et cetera. Any comments to that from maybe staff or the rest of the committee by way of explanation for Nori?
That's good, yeah. Mhm.
No, yes, no?
No, yeah, I think
Yes.
you captured it well, yeah.
Okay.
We're just trying to stay focused on making sure the guidelines do what they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
And get us to what I know everyone's really excited about, the main event, eventually getting the actual red lines of the guidelines, which I know Nori and his team has already started working on, but we're trying to flush out some of the bigger points through these conversations. So yeah, I think with that, let's carry on. If you wanted, I know initially there was a request for Nori to do a little bit of an overview again of like how the guidelines work and how they'll become or how the outline works and how they'll become the guidelines. But I think maybe, Madam Chair, you shared with me that might not be necessary. Or what did the committee want to hear from Nori before we start just diving in, and he's available for questions?
Yeah, if there are any questions maybe on this general task, maybe we keep it there for a moment, and then if the questions come up as we go. Anyone questions for Nori as we get started? I see shakings of heads around. Okay, so we were in the middle, or we had just finished. So just again, you may have already seen this, Nori, I don't know if you got it, but we had been kind of doing a funnel of principles. There's a little bit of maybe a slight reorganization, but not that much. So you have in Chapter 1 and 2 headings from 20 years ago, preserving the forest character, neighborhood street character guidelines, and we started kind of doing that same thing, going from like the biggest picture down funneling to more specific. So we were on number 4, talking about the way that a project or a property contributes to its street, which is a principle in your guidelines, always has been. And the phrasing, which I don't have a printout. Can I look at yours, Dawn, for a second? I typed it up. Use each property to enhance its own street and to contribute to Carmel's architectural heritage. None of these are set in stone, but they are just sort of a working draft at the moment. So we're on to number 5, which we don't know what that is yet.
Right.
But we're taking suggestions from the gallery, mostly toward my right, from Marianne. Marianne, go. You
Yeah,
start.
I just wanted to say something to number 4.
Okay.
I think that the language, I wonder how we could define that a little better, because, you know, when you look at that, how I think everybody who builds here has that intention. Everyone thinks they're contributing to the architectural heritage.
Good
And, you know, when you look at that house across from La Playa with all its ornamentation, I think those people really thought they were, you know,
Good
doing
point.
a contribution to the street. So I wonder if this, how this could be rephrased to actually, you know, I don't know. This is just throwing it out there, because I don't think that this heading has done its job basically over the last 20 years. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here actually and having
Right.
this discussion. So,
Are you talking about, excuse me, are you talking about that house with the brick and the,
yep,
The blue
your
one.
favorite house?
yeah.
My
Okay, I just
Okay.
wanted to know.
So,
Well, I mean,
I've got a
I am
visual
sure when
picture.
you think about it, that they thought they were enhancing its own street, you know? So otherwise, they wouldn't have done it, so.
So it sounds like to me, and again, I don't have it thought out in my head, but as a reaction to what you just said, Marianne, we would need to somehow better specify. So Carmel's architectural heritage is getting more specific, if you know what that is, but something that's more descriptive of what the street is supposed to be, I don't know. Or it's possible that 4 is not effective, period, you know, and that we can't have a 4. But
I really like the keep it modest heading,
yes,
you know,
yes.
because I think that whether it's traditional or these examples that were shown last time of contemporary, where it's just, you know, a bunch of boxes shoved into each other and some window details somebody saw in house and thought they were great to add, you know, it is the same hodgepodge of architecture that we're trying to avoid. And so the keep it modest, I think, in combination with a good landscape architecture, and give people more freedom actually than less, but guidance, you know, with the keeping it modest, because even in the 80s, you know, there were so many more simple Carmel cottages, and then somehow everybody thought they had to stick a window box on and shutters, and that don't work actually, and all this, you know, stuff to enhance. And I think that wasn't originally what made the town. You know, there was a whole bunch of beautifully scaled, very simple cottages.
So, I mean, I'm as a human, completely comfortable having this discussion in a very, trial and error way. We try a set of principles and we see how they fit together. If some of them don't make sense in the end, they get tossed. I all agree personally that keep it modest is fantastic. I don't know if maybe it's enough just as it's stated there.
I kind of like it as a follow-up to when it says subordinate each project to the natural features of the site. That actually says what the project is supposed to do. We don't want to actually contribute and make a big deal out of the house. We want to just be subordinate to the forest and keep the building project modest. I think that's a very good follow-up to that previous.
Is there anything I think, again, we should always just be trying everything on for size. So let's try that on for size. Keep it modest. People feel the same way Mary Ann does about the importance of that principle.
Mary Ann used a word which I think is essential too, which isn't in here, which is simple. Keep it modest and simple.
Simple, yeah, great, yeah.
Okay. And is there anything, so we're talking about, and the follow-up from Nori's language is design buildings and landscapes to be human-scaled, fit in with their surroundings rather than stick out. Let's review real quick that right before that, we had subordinate each project to the natural features of its own site.
That's great.
Can we just say stand out instead of stick out?
I don't know.
Well, let's not work on the descriptive part. Let's work only on the principles for now, because I think that's going to take a while. So just the bold text. So
okay.
if it's keep it modest, and simple, keep it modest and simple. Is there anything? I mean, I have to say, I might. If I were a newcomer, and again, we're thinking only about how accessible this stuff is. Is it going to sink in? Is it going to be usable by a complete newcomer to this? Would it be keep all buildings and landscapes simple and modest? Do you see what I'm saying? Can it stand on its own? Because that sounds like maybe I should dress modestly. Again, of course, that's not what's meant, and we're in a building code environment, but can the phrase stand completely on its own? Keep all buildings and landscapes simple and modest?
I would keep the landscape out. I mean, let the landscape
Building.
ordinance do the landscape.
We've already done that, okay. Keep all structures, keep buildings, keep simple and modest?
Unpretentious.
Unpretentious? But do we want to get the word buildings or structures in there?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. And is there any other, so keep, what do you think, Don? Building structures, hard built work. Nori, do you have any thoughts? You see where we're going? Trying to get the sentence to almost be its own thing all by itself? The bold type?
Well, I would argue, I mean, the bullet it says buildings, but it also says landscape.
So Madam Chair, I just realized that you guys were looking at something that I didn't have either.
I don't have it either. I don't know what happened to my.
But I don't know if I don't think I was copied on the email, and so I didn't forward this to Nori. So Nori, I just scanned a copy of this, what they're looking at with the numbered items, because I was a little confused too in the conversation. I didn't see the numbers that you're talking about.
I think something went wrong with my email.
So Nori, check your email right now. I just scanned it and sent you a copy of it. What they're actually talking about.
All right.
It's from last week.
Yeah,
also,
but the added 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, is what we didn't have.
Yeah, no, I had it in my notes, but I didn't, Somebody asked me to type it up, and I did not send it to everyone by accident. My apologies, including myself. And so I can't see it either. Anyway, so we're after, Marianne is positing that the fourth principle, instead of being about enhancing streetscapes, should be about the building itself and the qualities of the building and the modest and simple qualities. And there is a lot about landscape before that in those 4 or 3 principles that come before. Any final thoughts on keep buildings
Modest and
modest
simple.
and simple?
And
And-
then, but I think we should leave at least this idea in here, that each property is to enhance or shall enhance its own street and to contribute to Carmel's architectural heritage underneath that.
I think that's dangerous, Melanie. That is so subjective. You know, everybody has the intention to enhance the street. The guy with the brick also had the intention to.
You think so? I think he
Yes.
did what he wanted to do and he didn't care.
No, I think these people really love what they do.
Oh,
they,
right.
Yeah.
They love what they do, you know, and they want to make their own statement.
But they think it's a contribution to the
Well, they might
street.
think that, yeah,
Yeah.
or they might not even care if it's a contribution. It's what they want to do. It's their creative exercise.
Just an extra one, thank you.
I think it's extremely individual.
What is,
Yeah, so if we keep that out and just say it should be simple and modest, then we don't invite people to think of big, grand contributions to the town.
what about the word small? So here's another thing. Throughout Nori's old guidelines, there are many, many beautiful phrases about how when you have the choice, I don't know if you remember this, Nori, when you have an option, think about building a smaller house. It actually says that throughout the regulations. Here's a good way to make for example, I think if I'm channeling it, here's a good way to make your building look modest, make it smaller. Now, I know you have a very firm belief, Marianne, in the good use of varying the square footage.
And I think we just have to be realistic. When people pay the kind of prices they pay here, they want to maximize their use, and we might as well not stick our head in the sand and say you should build something smaller. It's just not going to
Not gonna
happen.
work. Okay.
People, they want to and need to maximize it. How we live, you know, every kid has their own bathroom, kind of a thing. That just has become standard, and I think we have to face that lots will be maximized.
Okay. Nora, you look like you're frozen there, as an aside.
No, I'm
Oh, there
here.
you're back. Oh, good. How about from the left here, it's the girls and the boys again. How do you all feel on the left about Melanie and this discussion that's happening here of Melanie saying we have to have this language in here, and Marianne asserting that folks do think they're making a contribution no matter what we say or what we think the guidelines should be, that we need to maybe keep the subjectivity out. It's less subjective to say, keep it modest, keep your buildings modest and simple, and that it's not that useful. Number 4, as we had it last week, may not be that useful. But maybe as a, commentary or something, but probably not as a principle.
You're right, just at a point afterwards, like Nori has, keep it modest, and then he goes on to describe. I mean, I think what we did last week I think it was good. And we had unanimity, but of course we've lived with this for a week or so, we can revisit it.
What do you all think on the left, Don and Doug?
I think we ought to have simple and modest in there.
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about whether we should get rid of 4 as a kind of guiding principle. That on this side, are you guys okay with that?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Yeah.
And that language, I think, is good that follows here. I mean, I don't know what, to keep landscape human scaled, I think that should go, because our trees that are 70 and 100 feet high, they are not human scaled, so I would keep the landscape out. And I agree with Melanie, it should say maybe stand out instead of stick out, but I think that is a good commentary under the keep buildings modest and simple as it stands.
Okay. I do want to make sure that we're focused on the bold text.
Yeah.
But yes, because we don't have that much time. Okay, so that's principle 4. So we've gone from, let's just review really quick, so we are on the same page. Restore and enhance the forest in all improvement projects, private, public, and otherwise. Subordinate, that's 1. Number 2, subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment. Number 3, subordinate each project to the natural feature of its site. I could say its own site, just to be clear. And 4, keep all buildings modest and simple. Okay, now, we have moved from sort of the environment down to the structure itself. And again, as we go forward and look at the other 0.5, 0.6, et cetera, I don't know, again, I'm going to turn to you, Marianne, just because you have to go earlier. If you have any sense of the flow or what type of principle should come next, looking, of course, also to the left and the chapter headings that are there now.
I like the next respect historic precedent.
Mhm.
I think that's a good follow-up to the keep it modest and simple.
And we do have, that does go, Melanie, back to Carmel's architectural heritage, which was in the prior 4. So if we have 5, but respect, here's another, this is another possibly subjective word. Do we have a way to, is that too subjective for us? Respect historic precedents? It says retain. This one is about retaining, at least if you go by the explanation, retaining buildings rather than knocking them down. I love that. I'm a retainer in general.
I think that's essential.
It's essential. But I don't think it's the 1.4 or whatever we come up with in terms of a 5 necessarily means just leave things as they are. There's other ways to respect historic precedent. What were you going to say, Marianne?
I just want to say that maybe it doesn't belong exactly here, that I find buyers very uninformed about the benefits of historic preservation. So they say, oh, the house is historic, or they try really hard not to make it historic. And they're always totally surprised when I explain to them, no, this is actually a real benefit. If you know the Interior Secretary standards for historic preservation, you can explain to them how beneficial that actually is to use all that, not even to speak of the Mills Act afterwards and the savings they could harvest from that. So I think if there's any way to refer back to the Interior Secretary standards or how somehow to communicate that retaining a historic building can be used to great benefit, because you will get a break on setbacks or other things, in order to, and that you can move a building around and make yourself more room for an addition of a new building. I mean, there's a lot of benefit to retaining the historic buildings.
Brandon and Nori, are you guys getting this in the sense of possibly a link or something there that could expand?
Yeah, I'm writing feverishly right now. That's a really good point.
Because we've had, Nori, a fair number of conversations about hyperlinking things, and this would be a great example, I think, of having some kind of introductory sentence and then a link to the types of benefits that Marianne's talking about. I don't think that doesn't really have to be so much explained in the design guidelines, but at least referred to, maybe. But what else, I guess what I'm getting at here is retaining, yes, for me anyway, personally. But is there anything else, like when I go back to the 4 that we just discarded, contribute to Carmel's architectural heritage, is there anything other than just retaining, that we would want to try to capture in this idea of respecting historic precedents? Is there anything about the design of a building, for example, a new building, that could also respect historic precedent? I don't even know what I'm trying to get at, but do you see the question? Because this is not just about what could be legally mandated in terms of preserving something that's on a register. But how do you deal with something that is historic maybe next door? Or a row of historic buildings, like we keep referring to these Henry Hill houses on Lopez that I visited and Carol's visited. How would you respect or respond to historic work when you are not just trying to retain it? Do you see what I mean? I'm thinking of
So
you
Madam
now.
Chair, I think I can help you, because I
Yes,
think I
go.
understand.
Okay,
So
go
it's
ahead,
almost like
Brendan.
you're suggesting, so you have the first bullet under 1.4 that's retaining traditional buildings. So that's keeping something in place, or if you're modifying it, retain
Mhm.
its. But for new construction, there's almost like a second bullet here. For new construction, kind of like how we treat the conservation district downtown, the project is analyzed to make sure that it won't have an impact on the surrounding historical buildings, even if the building itself isn't historic and it's going to be torn down and rebuilt. The HRB still has to make a finding that it's going to respect its surrounding buildings. So maybe that's kind of what you're talking about.
I think that's but I'm getting at a third thing also, which maybe has to do with scale and stuff like that, but which then is jumping the gun potentially. But I think of, for example, Don's house, Don Goodhue's house, which is a clear response to precedent, historic precedent in Carmel, and yet is inventive and something new. So to me, Don's house, and not everyone here maybe knows his house, but respects historic precedents. It is not a historic building yet, or I think it is. But do you see what I mean? This is something about interpreting the architectural heritage of Carmel, responding to it.
That's a good point, right there.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it goes back to you need a good architect to do that. So, I mean, you can write as much as you want to. It just,
I almost feel like I would wish for us and people who come to this town to understand historic precedent, to research it, these are actually more active verbs in some ways than respect. I think respect has to be in there, but that's again I'm looking at sort of a Marianne word in terms of contribute. I worry about it a little bit now that Marianne's alerted me to that.
Maybe an appropriate term is incorporate aspects somehow.
Can we ask?
relate to maybe,
Mhm.
or
So we said contribute.
build upon.
Respond, did you say?
Build upon.
Build upon?
I don't know. It's I don't
There
know.
was a,
Yes, I think that's what build upon by historic precedents.
build upon
I mean, that
historic
next
precedent?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Mhm.
what would be number 6, the fit with the context actually speaks to that,
It
right?
does speak to it. So what do you think about retain being in the bold part? Retain and respect, or retain and build upon historic precedents? Do you
That sounds good to me.
That's better in terms of just strengthening it, so respect isn't so wishy-washy in a way? I mean, even though it's a very strong word. Retain and build upon. And what do you think about bringing back Carmel's architectural heritage?
Yeah.
This
Say
is a-
that again, I missed
So
that.
we had, what we discarded, but people liked it at the end of last session, was contribute to Carmel's architectural heritage. So architectural heritage as opposed to historic precedents, it could be both. It could be retain and build upon historic precedents, it could be retain and build upon Carmel's architectural heritage, Carmel's historic precedent.
What does that mean to you exactly?
Well, to me, I don't know. I don't want to speak for the group, but when we debated it last time, I think Doug was pretty adamant about the architectural heritage aspect. That is a question of educating oneself about our architectural heritage, and now we're saying building upon it.
Yeah, so there's a debate right now, right, what architectural heritage is. We saw that unfold in the last meeting and the meeting
Yes.
before.
Yes.
So you have a group who thinks that just the, historic sort of, Hansel and Gretel kind of architecture is historic heritage. And then you have others who think that all that big contingent of mid-century architecture that we have in town and the prominent architects that lived here, they are part of our heritage. So what is actually our architectural heritage?
Well, we have, the staff can explain, we have documents in the city that are official about what our architectural heritage is. We could actually refer directly to that. It is, these are name styles, these are...
Yeah, we have the historic context statement that, you know, has specific styles in there, so that could be one resource to link through this.
Then I think it should be referenced again, and I think that is in dire need of update. I was part of doing that historic context statement many years ago.
It just did get updated. We just added 20 years to it.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Because
the
all
city
the
council
mid-century
just the city council just adopted it at their last meeting,
okay.
and so we're actually I'll send you a link to it. It's a
Okay,
fabulous
great.
document.
Okay.
Catherine Wallace on our team did a wonderful job on it. Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, I think that would be a terrific, again, we're talking about hyperlinks and stuff. I think that would be a terrific hyperlink under this principle. And we could name it in the principle, something like retain and build upon Carmel's official architectural heritage.
Yep.
People like that?
Yes.
Okay. Retain and build upon Carmel's official.
I want to just interject, if I may, because part of what I'd heard from some of the community, of course, was concern of respecting some of those that are not necessarily officially recognized. So I was trying to keep it a little bit broader. We certainly can, and later on in the outline, we do intend to cross-reference to the context statement, and in fact, we are bringing in some of that in that overview that shows up later, that was, I guess, actually in the preceding section, preceding this. Now I kind of forget where we are in the outline, but I would suggest that the lead sentence stay a little bit broader than just those that are officially listed. Sorry.
Take your time, don't push it. While you're sipping, let me ask you something, Nori. Couldn't we have it both ways? Couldn't we have the forcefulness of being aware of the official heritage in this other document, and also have as a bullet point an exception kind of clause? If you would say a little more about like the type of project which I'm sure is very important, the type of project you're worried about being, unacknowledged or
Well, there are generally a couple of types. One is those that are, more recent but haven't been officially recognized. Fortunately, since the update has just occurred, that's less likely. But the other is there are often buildings that are older, if you will, but have been altered and therefore don't retain sufficient integrity to be officially listed as an historic resource, but still are in scale and convey a lot of the character that people value. So I think I wanted to at least introduce the idea to consider the value of those properties as well.
I guess I'm personally hesitant to give up anything, really. So I want to get what you want, Nori, and I want to get what the group is talking about.
Well, as you're suggesting, just add another bullet point.
Yeah, okay.
Expands on that. That's easy.
Okay, and then we'll have the link and everything there too. Okay, well, so this is to be worked out. So, okay.
It's almost like the context statement is the floor.
Yes,
in a way,
yes.
Yeah, so that's the minimum. Like if something's on that, forget about it.
Right.
But then you can build upon that if you can make certain findings that will probably be later in the actual guidelines. But as an outline, there'll be 2 bullets. I think is
right.
Probably the best way.
So that was number 5, and again, this is nothing set in stone. We're trying it all on for size as a group of ideas together and how they flow into one another, etc. When I look at the organizing principles from page 9, and I go down to the bottom one, which is point 7, compatible diversity, I feel like that one, in terms of the scale of that comment, is a bigger scale than pay attention to detail, obviously. Detail is detail. It's like atomic level, maybe. So does anyone have any, so I would, just in general, if we're going to address something like that, I would bring it forward maybe to around where we are now in the outline. And it may, in fact, relate to exactly what we're saying, because first we're talking about looking backwards at history, and now we're at this point 7, seems to me, has to do a little bit with other style choices. Go ahead, Marianne.
I'm confused. I thought we were at point 5 and we are going to 6 now, no?
We are looking at left and right columns and making sure we address anything, if as a suggestion, principles that we feel like may be important for newcomers to understand as an entryway into these guidelines. So anything you see from the left or the right, in my view, is fair game to bring forward as an important principle. And anything that's in the guidelines now, and anything, so for example, smallness, I brought that up. It was not thought of as, and I totally accept that, it's just a suggestion. But that's something I noticed in the guidelines is a principle running through. We're going to say now maybe that is just hopeless, so we're not going to put it into a big principle. But anything is fair game in my mind, just for brainstorming. But we're at retain and build upon Carmel's official architectural heritage, and that is going to have some various sort of caveats and enhancements in the description. What topic do we think a newcomer could engage with, is logical to engage with after that?
I think the fit with context is a good follow-up to that. And were you suggesting to incorporate the detail with number 5? Respect historic precedent?
No, I don't think so.
I'm just talking about what is, like, we've seemed to be doing this funnel right now, and we don't have to stick with the funnel. But I do think there's a logic to that, where it's like big landscape and environment stuff down. If we're talking about history now as a kind of follow-up to modesty, then we have diversity below. I'm just throwing that out as sort of kind of in the same scale quality. History, simplicity, diversity.
So I think, Madam Chair, just
Yeah.
the question you're asking is, does the group want to just basically move 1.7 up so
That's
that
part
it
of-
falls in a different order?
Or any other concept
Yeah.
that we think follows right now from this discussion of history and modesty. Does diversity, and we also can say, diversity is not something that is a principle that is, a major organizing principle of the town. Is it or isn't it?
Why don't we just, in the line of looking at this, why don't we, after we have the respect and retain of the historic precedents and however that language is going to go, why don't we do, as a follow-up, consider doing pay attention to detail, then get into context, and then after context we could go to compatibility.
Well, I think we can talk about anything in any order, and then we can talk about the order of the principles as a separate topic also.
I think the historic context statement actually speaks to the diversity of architecture, so I think that could be embedded into number 5.
How do folks feel about that? Is it a thing enough to be its own principle? Requiring, and Nori, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, if it's top of mind for you, the types of principles that are in the current guidelines or that you would have thought to add to this compatible diversity concept.
Well, of course, a lot of the discussion in the workshop and certainly in the handbook was a recognition that there is a diversity of styles, many of which are compatible and were seen in the workshop and rated. In fact, at some point I'd like to review that with you all, but of how people responded to the different photographs, and a recognition that there is a diversity, but within limits, and that some of those that are diverse, and you've been referencing a couple of them, are outside that spectrum of compatibility. So this one is important and does need some bullets underneath it that gets that idea clear. We certainly will be working on language in the specific guidelines themselves about this one. This is a big one, obviously, but it is that making the point that there is a range of diversity that fits in, and it gets to what Marianne's been talking about in terms of fitting in. Certainly I think if you can provide a bullet under that, it'd be very helpful.
It also seems like we have an issue here that there are several principles throughout the guidelines that have to do with when you look to the left and the right of your neighbor, of your property, do not copy what they did. Isn't that part of?
That is too, yes.
Yes, because.
Yes, that's the second half of it. Yes, it is.
Yes, so the idea that you walk along the street, and you've phrased things along these lines too, Nori, I think, over the last months. You walk along the street, and it's interesting because it's not repetitive. So we have had moments in this city, in this town, where people have gotten outraged because this has to do with your compounding, I think, a little bit, where people, somehow a developer picks up 3 or 4 properties that are next to each other. I'm thinking of Taurus. Mm-hmm. And then the whole town freaks out because you have a series of 4 or 5 buildings that somebody built kind of around the same time, kind of with the same goals in mind, maybe speculatively, and then all of a sudden that idea of unique, crafted, interesting walks through town is gone, actually, for chunks of the streets.
But that's again how it's done. It's only about the quality of the people who do it, because you look at Henry Hill's 3 Sisters, it's exactly what you're talking about, but it's done really well, and therefore it's not a problem. So it all comes back to, if you have highly qualified people working in town, you don't have that problem. But that's why trying to regulate architecture is just...
Well, we are doing that, whether we think it's a hopeful project or not. So we're going to try to do it. We've gotten what we need for the landscape thing, we think, as that goes forward. So that's exciting. But as we do still have to address this, I think. And the question is, for maybe take it to the guys over here, is there a place for a similar level of importance put on diversity, on maybe we could talk about compounding here as a bullet point. Maybe we could talk about, I'm just thinking of bullet points that would support a concept of interest level, of uniqueness on adjacent properties. It really is in some ways the counterpoint, I might argue, to retain and build upon heritage. Do that, but at the same time do the opposite if you can. Don't clump together huge properties and make things look alike as you go from one site to the next.
If it's done well, that would be okay too, as we have a historic precedent that can also be done well, but that's the whole key.
And how would you phrase that, Marian? Like, how would you make it possible in a compatible diversity environment to have that Henry Hill series? Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not prohibited. Is there, again, a way to have both?
Well, I think if we build upon the historic context statement, there are several good examples in town. I'm also thinking about the David Allen Smith group on Scenic, for example. There's fantastic. These are houses that are very, very similar. It's continuously landscaped. It's wonderfully grouped. It's just well done, So there is plenty of examples of quote compounding that are done very well. And so if we build upon those very good examples that we have already in town, I think that's the learning by looking I think that's what we should encourage, you know,
Mhm.
just like every academy student starts copying the big masters just to get a feel for how to paint well. I think it's the same thing. Just look at what we have.
So, does everyone see, Marianne is arguing, I'm going to try to capture that, against this compatible diversity principle, I think. Or at least against it being its own principle, and instead being embedded in the idea of studying the historic precedents that we have. We need to have, maybe we have to have a vote, because I can't tell what everyone else thinks about this. I'm going to start with you, Doug.
We listen to see if anybody in the public wants to
Oh, okay.
comment.
We could take a break.
Carol?
Carolyn
yes.
Mueller. Yes, sorry?
Calling.
Carolyn.
Yes. Hi.
Yes.
Carolyn.
Go ahead.
Carolyn Mark Davis, and I'm an architect, and I was born in Carmel, and I just am listening in. Everything that Marianne says, I'm saying, here. I mean, I can't stress that strongly enough. Looking at the good examples, not putting, a mountain of words out there so that we as architects have to try to not only figure out what we do without words, but then try to somehow, fall within this giant outline that's been written. I think the whole thing could be simplified, and everything Marianne is saying, I just totally agree with.
Okay, there's a vote for Marianne there. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining us. Carol Hall has a comment, it looks like.
Yes, thank you. Marianne's a modern architect, and she's reflecting that. Carmel Preservation Association is, as you know, trying to preserve the traditions of Carmel, and we don't think that, generally speaking, there are always exceptions, and we can always bring up exceptions, but that modern architecture is what we want to see in our village. So that's my vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Okay. Again, I mean, I don't disagree with anything Marianne's saying. I don't disagree with what Carolyn's saying on the phone. Of course, if we have an excellent architect, they don't have to read this, potentially. They just know. It's in their blood. They understand, they look and learn, as Marianne just pointed out. But this really isn't for them. Let's keep that in mind. This is for everybody else. This is for people who come to town and have no clue of what they're looking at. And we have to teach them what they're looking at. So the question is, again, to the left here, should we give up on anything that would help a layperson or a builder, someone who doesn't have a great architect on board, treat the streets? I mean, this is Nori put this here as a kind of placeholder for a whole set of concepts that are currently in our guidelines. Don't disagree that there are exceptions by great architects who have made it work. But is there something to this that needs to stay for everybody else? Or do we bag it?
I want to disagree with you on the usage.
Mm-hmm.
I think the usage is much broader than new owners.
Yes.
Usage is the planning staff when
Yes.
they review a project. It's the design review board or planning commission.
Mm-hmm.
There's a much broader emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's who the message is conveyed for. I don't think there are many owners that come to town to pick up the design guidelines.
Right. Right.
Is that your experience?
Yeah.
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 So what is the implication of that for whether we address diversity in design or along a streetscape or along a group of buildings? Don, how about you?
I'm sitting here, I think 1.7 belongs right at the end, because to me that says, summing up, encourage it with all these other qualities and directives, encourage a compatible diversity.
But do you so you think diversity is something that is the same level of importance as the other principles?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so there's a vote on that side. And diversity to you, as like if you had subpoints to that, what kinds of things would be accomplished by having notes about diversity in these principles?
We'll have to think about that.
Like what, so if you had to build and support that statement, compatible diversity on a streetscape or whatever, you would support it by saying, for example, buildings of the same material should not be next to one another, for example. Or compounding can only work if, it's been carefully studied by somebody who really knows what they're doing, or whatever. So what types of things does this help us accomplish in terms of diversity, as a principle?
Avoid repetition, but that's just a simple.
Avoid repetition. Can you think of anything, again, we're just we have a divided group here, Nori, on whether this is sort of a subset of history and it gets taken care of there and great architects can work with as well, or if people need guidance on this that the staff can work with, et cetera. What kinds of things
I think this one
supported?
I think this one is important to be its own principle. I think it's a key one. I understand it's hard to define it, and several of the very specific things you're talking about will be handled back when we get into that section on the guidelines, which is on page, I don't know if you all have the whole outline with you there, but it is the concept level building design. Where is that? Page 18 in my printout. Item 11.2 has those two subpoints, and I think we could frame those in a bullet form. It says avoid repetition of the same design and accommodate new styles that fit in. Those are the two aspects of this compatible diversity that we're talking about. I think some of the specifics about be careful about, when you're doing a series of buildings together, how you do that, that can all be handled back in the detail of the guidelines rather than up at this high principles level. But I feel it does need to be there. I do like the fact that it is sort of the wrap-up one after all else is said and done. It's that balancing of diversity and compatibility that's key.
So the idea of a possibly problematic series of buildings or compounding could be kind of the part of the explanation of this one, is what you're saying.
Well, I think that can be handled in the body of the guidelines themselves. I think that's a little too specific to be here. In the body, but I mean, it would be this category of principle. It would be related to this category in your mind. It would be, and I think it would be talking about avoiding repetition in designs, but the idea of it being, whether it's a compound or you're just copying the house next door, it's that diversity that's important. So let me add one other question about this particular one. We have done this group has tried to do a, strong active verb approach, as always, to everything. And in our phrasing from last week, we have, active verbs. This one says encourage. Does anyone have, well, first of all, I think we need to take a vote really quick on whether again, Nori has said he wants this one. Don is in favor of this as a principle. Marianne wants it subordinate to the historic precedent thing, but it's maybe feeling, outmaneuvered. Melanie, what is your view? Is this a principle of the same level of importance as the other principles, or at least similar level of importance? Or is it a subordinate principle? And while I can also just ask everyone that question.
Doug thinks it's subordinate. Don, I think, said he thought it was not subordinate. So Doug and Marianne are on the subordinate. You, Melanie, you might be the tiebreaker.
Are we going to include the words within limits? Because the statement was made when we first addressed this. Encourage a compatible diversity in design within limits. Is that what we're going to talk about?
We can. I mean, that could either be part of the explanation of it. It could, we haven't talked about the phrasing of that. I have a problem with the word encourage just because in general it's throughout and that's caused so many problems.
Yeah, I don't like the word encourage there.
I don't know if there's any.
Foster,
What'd you say?
foster. instead of
Foster?
encourage.
Mm-hmm. One could think about addressing the person, him or herself, who's building the thing and say, you know, something about, ensure your project is different or is compatible but diverse. I don't know exactly how to address that, but so I think, so Melanie, am I correct in understanding that you think it is a principal level?
No, I don't
Concept.
really. I think Mary Ann's correct. That
Okay.
It should be up top, and it should not say encourage, and I think it should say within limits.
And it
I
should,
think this is open for misunderstanding if we don't have those clarifying bullets that have been mentioned.
so what you're saying is this historic precedent one that we worked on, retain and build upon Carmel's official architectural heritage, that compatible diversity as a concept is subordinate to that. That's your claim. That's your position.
Well, if you're defining compatible diversity with talking about the context of a block or in the context of being part of this village in a forest, it all makes a difference. And to me, as it stands right now, I just have a problem with it, period.
Okay, let's talk about context then. Let's table this one for a second. I think we are really divided here on this. So, and
Madam Chair, could I
Yes,
add
go ahead.
something? The illustrious
Please.
Doug Schmitz pointed something out to me that,
Yes.
because he has the entire general plan memorized apparently.
yeah.
There are a couple sections in our general plan, the city's general plan and the housing element that talk about diversity in architecture and housing. So just for what that's worth and to add into the conversation, it talks about diversity in architecture being encouraged as long as proposed designs perpetuate the broader elements of community design that characterizes the streetscapes within each neighborhood. This is in the housing. The remaining lots reflect a wide diversity of larger sizes. The program helps achieve diversity and balance of housing types that are affordable. And then the other one, the city also currently encourages the merger of small lots into large lots to promote diversity in design and housing and to preserve open space. So for what that's worth, it's a large enough topic that it's mentioned in our general plan. So
Doug, when you bring that up, is that a vote?
There's been a hand up for.
Oh, there's a hand up. Okay, one moment. When you bring that up, Doug, are you, but you were on the side of it's a subordinate point because it's covered elsewhere? Okay, I see. So I think, Don, you're now in the minority.
I don't have any trouble with it either way.
Okay, good. All
I
right,
don't like
he's
that.
flexible. All right,
Pro
so,
and con.
so what I think that means is, at least for this group, and I'll take out to public real quick in a second here, but is that principle, this group, Nori, if you're picking up on what I'm picking up on, would like to see it possibly as part of a context principle, or certainly cross-linked with the general plan and all the other places it has it, but maybe for some reason not as its own thing, but we'll come back to that. That's just the vibe at the moment. And I'm going to ask, I saw a hand up. Is it still up? Okay, Neil, would you like to chime in?
No, thank you, and good morning, everybody. I don't know where to insert these into the conversation, but since we're talking about concept and Melanie is mentioning the idea of within limits, and we're talking about the historic legacy of Carmel. And Carol and I have had this done a number of times. Somebody puts a book in front of us. Here's the record of all the architecture in Carmel. And look, there's mid-century modern. I need to say this, and I'm hoping that everybody in the CPA is also listening. Because a style appeared in Carmel some point in the past does not automatically say that style is fine forevermore from that period of time. We have made huge mistakes in allowing certain modern style homes into Carmel, as we demonstrated with our presentation in the previous steering committee meeting. And so we obviously made mistakes in the past. So I always have people point to these mid-century homes and, well, you like that one, don't you? And I ask myself, why would you assume I like that? It's because we assume everybody likes it because it's been there 50 years. We're used to it. We now become comfortable to it. And that's a part of Carmel. That's different than saying we really liked that style of house when it was originally built. I'm very concerned about this context always constantly pulling us back and opening that door to modern style architecture. Hearing now the discussion about the Henry Hill homes, I see that's going to be used as kind of the icebreaker. These are modern homes that are okay in Carmel. Take shots of the exteriors of those homes and put them in one file, like a Word file, and you document the exteriors of the Henry Hill homes and put them in a Word document and ask yourself if that's what you want Carmel to look like. Okay, so I'm bringing this forward because I think it's a real strong point that the CPA wants to make at some time. We're scared to death that any existing sort of modern style homes out there will be used to break open this resistance that the residents in Carmel have to these styles that seem to have less feeling, less heart, more machine-like, less human scale. And the other one, and this is really, in a way, it's a complicated point. We're saying that what determines whether you are building a successful traditional style is that it matches exactly the language of a style, such as a craftsman style or a Spanish style or whatever. And then you look at that style in the books and you say, well, you don't match that exactly. What if somebody in Carmel creates a brand new style that has never been used before, and it begins to, people understand it and they like its effect on village character? Are we going to say no to that house because it doesn't fit into craftsman, it doesn't fit into Mediterranean, it doesn't fit into Spanish, doesn't fit into colonial? I think the question is, does the design contribute to Carmel character? Not, is it a correct version of craftsman? So those 2 points, we're concerned.
Thanks, Neil. I totally get what you're saying. I'm going to just sum it up here. It's not just about, Neil's point is it's not just about style particularly, but about character of the village in general. And it's not about building on past styles necessarily, because all of them are not equally valid, but about making sure that what is proposed stylistically is consistent with Carmel's character. Thank you for weighing in, Neil, on that. I think this discussion about diversity, again, Nori, I think possibly, and I don't know how strongly you feel about this, Nori, I feel like the committee has leaned heavily toward somehow having the diversity as part of either context or historic precedents. I think what we should do is, like I said, table it, go to this context one, which is very large, turn to Marianne, who's got time constraints, and tell us as much as you can, Marianne, before you have to leave, about context and detail or anything else you want to talk about, so we can at least channel you when you leave, if we can.
I think that's a great topic, fit with the context. I think that's, yeah, I mean, it's number 3 already says subordinate the project to natural features, and then I think fit with the context would then relate the same thing basically, but related to the buildings that are in the on your block. So, and then
you think the diversity point belongs there potentially? We don't know yet. You don't have to answer that. You don't have to, I don't want to.
I think that it belongs under the respect the historic precedent,
Okay.
because that is what our town is about. You know, it is about diversity. And then all the building size and volume and the details of the building, all of that, as it is outlined here, with fit with the context, I think is a good spot for that.
When we look over on the left-hand side, this is like a little brain teaser, and we think about context, are there things from the list on the left that seem clearly to relate to, because a lot of the stuff we've picked up, the chapter headings over here, like preserving the forest character and the street character, et cetera, the topography we've referred to now in the organizing principles. Is there anything else in context here, including these bullet points that Nori's suggesting, that needs to be handled here?
Well, I don't know where on the right side the topics of privacy, views, light and air, parking and access that are important, you know, open space, to be covered somewhere. And I'm not sure what Nori's idea was, how to cover that on the new principles.
That's a good question, and I would throw out as a suggestion, Nori, you'll tell me if you had thought of this or if you were avoiding it for some reason. Somewhere in your new thinking, in your revisions, I've seen mentions of just neighbors in general, and neighbors obviously show up and are mentioned throughout the existing guidelines. Maybe a principle here somewhere. I don't know if it's between 5 and 6, if it's between 4 and 5, it's between, you know, where it should be. Maybe has to do with respecting your neighbors in general, respecting your neighbor's project, and then privacy and views and things like that come under there. Also compatibility or reactions to site design and all those beautiful sketches about how, you know, if one building is poking to the left, the other one shouldn't poke to the right at the same exact spot.
I just wanted to hear from Nori what his thinking was about how where the left bullet points went, basically.
So Nori,
how he wanted to incorporate that.
The topics on the left are the subsections within the guidelines themselves, and so they are at a finer grain of detail. And I wasn't. I don't think that the principles need to directly link to each of those, but I think it's good to be thinking about how those principles will influence how the guidelines in each of those categories are worded and what the tone of them is. And because a lot of the current language does that, in that it's always saying think about your neighbors, be subordinate, etc. So these high-level principles should make sense for any of those individual topics, but conversely, the individual topics don't need to show up specifically in the principles.
Are you saying, Nori, what we see on our page here as organizing principles that are existing are actually not the existing organizing principles?
Those aren't, I don't know.
So I can try. So those are chapter headings right now. I think what
that's it's labeled at the top there.
Yeah. So I think what Victoria was trying to do, and Madam Chair, you can, because you put this together, what the chair was trying to do was sort of have not apples to apples, as you can't do it exactly, but look at what exists right now on the left and taking these chapter headings as what the guidelines as a document focuses on, like almost pretending in a way that these are the key principles, if this is what every chapter is about, and looking at it next to the section that we're creating in the new guidelines, which are actual organizing principles that may turn into that checklist that we make people fill out on the beginning side to see, you know, is there something in these new principles, the principles that we're putting together, is there something that's maybe missing or that isn't reflected from the previous chapter headings? So it isn't apple to apples. It probably shouldn't say organizing principles on the left column. It should just say existing chapter headings.
So we are not creating new chapter headings?
Well, here,
Well-
let me throw out, Nori, before you, I'm sorry, just as an example, number 10 on the left, chapter heading 10, is landscape guidelines. Our first three principles from this group, and building off of your suggestions, Nori, were about landscaping and subordinating to landscaping. I would imagine that if we're talking about the outline level of this project, that landscape guidelines might end up being more under the, like if you were a newcomer or anyone, a new planning commissioner, and you're looking for how to deal with the forest, you would then expect that the links would be grouped together in that way. So even though I don't think, Nori, and you're now going to correct me if I'm wrong, but that you thought of these chapter headings as principles, but they are organizing the document now. They're not phrased as principles, but they are organizing phrases or words.
Okay, so Victoria, are we now creating new chapter headings, or what are we
So let's
doing?
let Nori answer
Yeah,
that.
let's have Nori.
But I thought Victoria created that on the right side.
These are the two ways. So these are organizing. No, this is Nori's language on the right.
Yeah.
On
Okay.
page 9.
Okay, so Nori, were you not intending to make these new chapter headings? Or what, how do they this relate to the existing chapter headings?
These generally follow the subsections, if you will, that are within the existing guidelines. They are slightly renumbered, a little bit reorganized, but basically are the same topics and in the same sequence. That's why the term landscape guidelines is basically those that start with item, let's see, where does the break from concept to final occur here? Number 9, 10, and 11 track the organization of the final phase design guidelines as they currently exist. Remember, there's a 2-step review process. So all of those preceding that are at the concept level. Now, in some cases, to elevate a topic, we, for example, it could be, I'm not really remembering specifically right now, but it could be that items 3 and 4 are mushed together in the current document. And we saw an opportunity to separate those to give it a little bit more focus, if you will, for each of those topics. But the sequence is the same as is in the current guidelines, the 2 books.
Do you have one of these over there? The guidelines?
Yeah.
I could show you really quick what he's talking about.
And certainly some things, I think, some specific guidelines, as once you get into them, you may say, oh, this one needs to move up to the concept level, or it needs to move down to the final design level.
Right here.
Yeah, but then I don't even know why we have them
Hold on, we're
across
having
from,
a
why do we have
sidebar
them
here,
across
Nori.
from
1
here?
second.
So I'm back to where I was when I came in here at first, confused, because I don't know why we are putting this across from each other when they are actually meant to be something different.
Well, let's talk about that a little further. I don't know if you could hear that, Nori.
This is too bad that I have to bolt.
Oh, you have to go. This is the whole part. Marianne,
Yeah.
Marianne is asking, about the legitimacy of looking at chapter headings as principles. And I'm not sure I'm quite following, Nori, your explanation that these principles are drawn from these chapters, I think is what he's saying. I don't know.
Well, they were high level. I mean, there were some early principles embedded in the introduction of the older guidelines, and then certainly a lot of these came out of the earlier workshop. These were, and it's something that you all discussed. And no, I don't think there is a principle necessarily that is unique to each of the chapter topics on the left-hand side. What I can see here, though, is in looking at each of those chapters, are there one or more of the principles that will influence the way in which they are written? And so parking and access is a fairly specific kind of topic, but keep it modest applies to that. Respect the forest applies to that. Same thing about building form. Respect historic precedents, keep it modest, fit with context. Those high-level principles will shape and do shape a lot of the wording that already exists in the guidelines. So I think this is a useful cross-check, but no, I did not. I don't think it makes sense to try to write a principle for each one of those chapters.
So
They
what
should
are
be
you?
higher level. They should fire on several cylinders, if you will.
So are you intending to keep the chapter headings the same?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
Okay, so then,
yeah, I think I assumed that when we were talking, and I will tell you this is my assumption, that when we were talking about the organization of an outline, that there was a possibility, anyway, of discussing how folks, especially lay people, can enter into the guidelines in a more intuitive way. And I guess my pitch would be, as someone who's worked with guidelines, for decades all over the country, that it wouldn't be my intuition as a layperson to think, I wonder if there's something about access that I could look up. Like, I'm looking for a chapter about parking and access. And we have this wonderful design guideline that we've been successfully using, but sporadically in the last 20 years, because there's a disconnect between concepts that humans can understand who are not professionals and trying to find that information in the chapters. Not that, right now, I thought the conversation we're having is like, how could we make that a little more intuitive for lay people? I think it's very easy for professionals like you, Nori, like me, like Marianne, like Dawn, to think, when I think about looking up information, go ahead, Marianne, nice to see you. Please submit.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I just want to say that I really liked the idea of addressing the specifics under the new organizing principles, because I think that is a good way of explaining what is meant by, otherwise people go straight to the practical things and this first chapter, and then nobody will read again. But if we keep it modest and simple, actually talk to address building form and
Shape
scale and
form.
all this kind of stuff, then you can put two and two together. If you make this your own chapter, it's just somebody will just page right over it and go to, okay, what can I do in mass and scale? So I'm sorry to leave you with this, but I think that is actually a huge topic.
Yes,
I
it is a
think,
huge
to-
topic, and
yeah.
we're going to have it as soon as you exit the room. I can no longer contribute. But
Well, I said
keep taking notes, Marianne. I'm sorry you have to go.
Marianne, happy holidays.
We won't see each other. Yeah. So, Nori, you see, I don't know if you heard that. I think the hope is that you and the staff and everybody is open to a more intuitive entrance into these guidelines, because the consternation that the citizens have had for so many years is that these guidelines have almost everything we need in them, but somehow they fall by the wayside over and over again. And these organizing principles that we've discussed for many months, that we are now kind of, examining and just checking if they're the way we want them, et cetera, and suggesting, I think in some ways minor tweaks. If that could be the checklist that Councilmember Barron keeps raising, if that could be the entry point for newcomers to this document. And by newcomers, I also mean new planning commissioners,
Right.
new staff members.
Absolutely.
If people had a one-pager, possibly not on page 9, possibly as a cover sheet or something that was so important that we could frame it and put it on the wall, and that would be something people could remember as, oh, that, I now understand, I'm coming from Texas, I understand that I have to build a modest building here. Now, how do I do that? I go to Keep It Modest and I hyperlink and click, and it shows up in different places in the ways in which that modesty as a principle is preserved in this town. But everyone, I think, can understand that. I think we understand modesty. We don't know to look for access and parking as a thing, but we understand the concept of modesty. So I think this was the hope, is by looking at these two things, because the organizing principles, I mean, you wouldn't call them principles maybe, except, I don't know, neighborhood street character. It's not phrased as a principle, but they are organizing, these chapters are organizing the document now. And the idea that it could be more accessible as a document is what we were after. So I personally hope that Marianne has given this testimony. I'm seeing nods all around the table. I think Brandon has said things like this. We were hoping, I think, that Nori, you were open or willing to consider a way to have cross-references that would be more intuitive.
Well, certainly we'll be putting cross-references in. Right now, if you look at the outline for pages 9 and 10, that basically fills a page. If you wanted it as a page right up front, at that level, without adding too many more bullets, it can fit on a page. If you start commenting on each of the design chapter topics under each of those, it's going to get longer. Yeah. And the idea was to keep it succinct and then be certain that they drive and influence all of the material that follows. We can certainly reiterate some of those principles and introductions to each of those topics, however you want. I had felt making them be design guidelines so that they are on the checklist for compliance would be stronger than putting them up front, because we've done that in many, many situations. And as you said, people skip over it. They want to go to what are the rules about parking. Well, this way it says, no, the first set of guidelines you must meet are these guiding principles. That's why we've numbered them in the outline as guidelines. So that in that checklist to be developed, compliance with these would have to be checked off. Now, they could be put up front and repeated maybe in some way, as you suggest, so that it is right there at the beginning. But I do know that people will skip over that.
Well, I think what we're saying is nobody, and again, please group, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone thinks that we're not even looking at these bullet points now. Those are not the principles. The principles are whatever ends up in bold. And there's going to be 10 or 5 or 7 or whatever. And that will be the thing people carry around with them that they can access, that community neighbors can talk about on the street. Oh, that doesn't look, the plan they have for that house, I don't like it. It's not modest enough.
Well, then that works. Have those right up front, and then they are repeated here as guidelines with the bullet points where they are currently in the outline.
And then the following up question is, can these then be somehow fused with chapter headings so that when they get explained even more and more, the information from the chapters that relates to the principles is primarily grouped with whatever principle it relates to. So landscape type things, for example, would be grouped with the landscape principles. That, I think, was the other hope for accessibility to the document.
Well, I wonder, Madam Chair, and Nori, tell me what you think about this. I wonder if, like in zoning code, a lot of times we'll have at the beginning of every chapter a purpose statement that helps you when you get into rough interpretations of where you're supposed to go with it. So I wonder, Nori, if you've done anything or what you would think about the idea of at the beginning of each chapter just having a number like this chapter, you're going to want to reference these 3 guiding principles. So principle 1, 2, and 3, and you'd have a hyperlink back to them, so you can read them as you're going through, so that it's at the top of each chapter. You know what to expect.
Even a sidebar, sure.
Yeah. I don't know what the committee thinks about that idea, but.
So, I think
It makes sense.
that's the direction I think that the group was hoping to go, is that there's some logic to, so that somebody doesn't think to themselves, okay, if I want to fit with the context of my neighborhood, how do I do that? And then they would go to the fit with the context chapter, and there would be cross-references to the things that help you fit with the context. That's Melanie's nodding. Does that make sense on the left, Doug? And so I don't know, maybe we're talking about 2 slightly like almost inverses of each other. Either the chapter headings have the principles referred to, or the principles have chapters under them that support the principles.
I think that gets a little complicated. I think it's easier to do the first, to highlight in each of these chapter topics which principles are key for that. I think trying to put the guidelines under the principles will get, I think that can be confusing, because you're dealing with different levels, and particularly if we're continuing to have a 2-step review process, it's kind of difficult to talk about parking and access under one of these principles and to divide it into concept and final.
Well, let's talk about parking and access. I think that's an interesting one. What does it relate to as a principle? What is parking and access? And what principles are engaged by discussing parking and access?
Oh, fit with context, keep
Yes,
it modest.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Context.
Restore and enhance the forest, dealing with the edge of a parking lot or in the residential area of an individual parking space. Several of these principles will relate to that.
Okay. All right. So I think we're just going to have to figure that out, how that structure works, how we can make sure that these the bolded principles really provide a way into the document. I think that's the concern, right, of the committee, and maybe the staff is Brandon nodding his head also, that this is the part we have the most hope for, I think, in terms of an access point for the public and for all of us who are coming at this from different. And it needs to be somehow infused throughout the document in a way that people always can think of those principles, like sort of the 10 commandments of what makes Carmel so great. So I know that we have, is it 9:30? Yes. So, and Brandon has a hard stop at 10:30. So let's see if we can move forward a little bit, and just having had this exchange, percolate it a little bit and think about how, the ways in which we can do that. But let's not focus on that right now, so we can get through these bolded principles, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's a good discussion. So I think folks were thinking that historic precedent leads into, as it is here, fitting with the context.
Yeah.
So fit with the context. We have said this in the sense of the forest. Is there a clarification to context or a differentiation here? Because we have had already two or three things, and including the historic part, that talks about natural and features of the site and natural parts. Is this a different type of context for this group of bullet points? Oh, here's remember your neighbors, by the way.
Yeah.
Is this a building context here primarily? Is this a different type of context?
I had put My notes that, I'll probably gotta turn it on too. We ought to remember not only the site, but the street.
Yes, absolutely.
And tell me more about what you mean by that, Doug.
Well, we don't want a house that's not compatible with the street.
Right,
Either it's neighbors or the street setting.
yeah.
So I think it needs to be expanded beyond just the structure, building materials, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think where we have fit with the topography at the bottom, that ought to be the first bullet after key design factors. Because we'll start with the property and then you'll design around that.
So we have as 3, we thought that was important enough to make a number 3, subordinate each project to the natural features of its site. And I would think topography would be a bullet point there.
Absolutely. But can't you have something both places?
Well, that's the question. I mean, is maybe that bullet point fit with the topography goes under natural features of the site? That seems to me a very close match. But that's my question to you all. Is context in this, because we've talked so much about the natural context and we really spent a lot of time on that last week, is this context different? Should we highlight different things here than the natural context? Because we've covered the natural context in 3 other principles here. Is this maybe a different place, a different topic here? If we reiterate it, I think it's a little bit illogical because you're looking to the first 2 or 3 principles for the natural piece.
Madam Chair, maybe we can
Yes.
check with Nori and see, sort of his reason, because I think, 1.1 and 1.2, as you point out, were about context of the natural environment. Perhaps, Nori, 1.5, was that meant to be context with the built environment, or how did you look at that?
Yeah, we could say fit the building with the context.
But with the built environment more? Because we're talking here, building materials, color.
Well, both, though.
So if we have, again, I know you've just got this lately, but from our last week's session, we have subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment. 3, subordinate each project to the natural features of its site. If you were going to context, I mean, is there, I almost feel like if we were to cover natural context as bullet points under this, then that would be almost a replacement for key principles. There's not much in these bullet points here that has to do with natural features except the topography, which we've covered above. It seems to be mostly about the neighbors. Remember your neighbors. Now, it doesn't have to stay that way, but the question is for this group, what has not been covered yet in what we've done so far in terms of context?
I don't know. I like this the way it is, pretty much.
Okay.
I think we can add a few things. But I think it fits in our sequence, and I think it's very descriptive of everything we've talked about relative to making things work in the neighborhood as well as making them work in the village.
So what are we adding to this that has not been covered so far? Maybe is another way to phrase it in our other principles. Any thoughts, Doug?
I'm going to throw a freebie out
Yes.
there that I'm surprised Doug and Mary and Melanie at Bolton have said. The one thing maybe, Nori, that maybe you would say this is covered deeper in, but I would say, like site improvements, fences, hardscaping, like that should also be in the context of your surrounding neighbors. But I don't know if, Nori, you think that's better to cover later in the guidelines versus in a principle?
No, let's try listing it there, that's fine.
So fences, walls, and lightings are part of analyzing the local, the immediate context, you're saying?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Are we talking about immediate context? I just said that by accident, but is that more what this is about? Versus the whole heritage of Carmel, the whole, maybe that's the difference here, is that this is about, no?
It's all of the above. And remember in that outline, earlier, there is a discussion of what is context and the comment that it's at those different levels. Let's, where is that? Trying to see where that occurs. I guess it's in the, yeah, on page 7.
Of the current outline?
Yeah. So right now, before you get to these principles, you will have read about what does context mean, and that there's a citywide level, a neighborhood level, and then your block. And that can vary by neighborhood.
So again, my fear, just personally, as a sort of member of this community, is that no one will read any of this, period. And therefore, this set of principles is our best hope for something people can keep top of mind. So I want to make sure that something about the language of each of these bolded things captures your meaning, Nori, almost in and of itself. I know that's almost impossible to do that in a pithy way. But if there's a way to modify this sentence, fit with context, to make clear that this is different than subordinating each project to the natural features of its site, that it's different from subordinating all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment, that it's different from retaining and building upon Carmel's official architectural heritage, that it's different from keeping all buildings modest and simple. What is it that this is how is this different? How is this a thing in and of itself fitting with it? Because it really is a very broad, as you have pointed out, Nori, it is a very broad idea that actually all of this, in fact, you could say this is the entire guideline is fit with the context. You could throw away this entire document and 20 years of, and just say fit with the context. Really, right? That's what this is. Learn about your environment and fit in, for crying out loud.
Don't you wish, yes.
Right? So there's something that's got to be a little more specific about this that differentiates it from the other principles, is my thought as a way into it. Is it about the immediate context? Is it about the built context? Is it about the neighbors, really, which is the first bulletin point? You know, look at your neighbor, and because the entire guideline is to fit with the context. So what's specific?
Do you have wording you're thinking about?
No, you may sound like I do, but I'm really just thinking out loud or asking out loud. There seems something to me about this that if it's a catch-all, then it really is almost the guideline itself.
Well, one thing to do, an easy thing, is again to put a link and a reference back to this discussion about context.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a bullet under the principle.
So if I go to understanding what is context, how context, so I'm looking now on page 7 of the outline, factors that distinguish one neighborhood from another. So, I mean, to me, if I'm channeling you, Nori, I feel like you think it's about the neighborhood. It's an intermediate scale. This particular one.
What we heard was, people have said, Carmel as a whole has a spirit, and that needs to be respected. And that's these broad things about handcrafted being small, being simple. But then there is the neighborhood. And most neighborhoods are fairly similar, but there are some differences, which may be because of the period in which that subdivision occurred and the age of the buildings, or their orientation to topography. those areas in steep canyons are obviously different than those that are in the more traditional gridded area, or those that are in around the Mission Tract. And so there are some distinctions by neighborhood that are going to influence what context and compatibility means.
Okay.
And then there's your immediate neighbors.
Okay.
And the idea of not copying what's next to you.
Perfect. Okay, now I finally have an idea after all this discussion. Thank you. And you tell me if this captures it. Fit every structure within its neighborhood context. So now we've introduced the idea of neighborhood through this principle, which I think is what you're trying to do. Is that right, Nori? Because we've talked about the heritage of the whole town in terms of architecture. We've talked about the heritage of the whole town in terms of nature and how to subordinate everything. So this allows you, Nori, to talk about all the stuff that gets a little bit to that middle scale. How is the building on the site? Which way do the windows look? Are you respecting neighbors' privacy, right? So fit each structure, which includes fences, somebody threw in,
Yes.
within its neighborhood context. Is that a little bit, drilling down on it a little bit, to differentiate this from everything we've said before?
Okay.
What do you, do I see nods?
Yeah.
Don, tell me, what are you thinking?
Frankly, I'm a little, don't quite understand how this is all going to shake out. And,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either.
Yeah.
But we're trying to come up with principles that people can carry around with them in their minds or in their notebooks, in their billfolds, that this is different than fitting in with the historic precedent and fitting in with the context of the forest and fitting in with the architectural history of the town. This is respecting your neighborhood context, right? Does that make sense, Melanie? What do you think? Because the first thing under here is remember your neighbor. And then we talk about building size, building form and proportion. All that has to do with reactions. And all those beautiful diagrams Nori has always had, that I have referred to over and over again, about if the driveway on the right goes this way, the driveway on the left should go that way. And the building, if there's a high part on this building, the other part shouldn't have a high part right next to it. That's the neighborhood context, right?
Right.
Does that make sense to you, Nori? Am I channeling you properly?
That'll work. Let's try that.
Okay, fit every structure within its neighborhood context. I feel like that does capture a whole group. Brandon, what do you think? Of kind of middle scale stuff that's in this guideline. Okay. And I don't.
Good wording.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think maybe to Don's, what the point Don was making about how it all shakes out, I think we should throw some stuff down like we're doing and then look at it all again.
Yeah.
In one piece.
Yeah,
And
see if
make
we're
sure that
missing
we're not
anything.
missing something, we didn't accidentally delete something, or we're not duplicating. So yeah, I think it sounds like the committee's in agreement, so I think we should possibly move on to the next one.
Let's move on to the next
Yeah,
one.
mhm.
So again, I don't think we need to deal with the bullets at all. We're not trying to smith the bullets. Those will be explanatory things. They'll show up wherever you want.
Is
Don,
that
what were you going to say?
last terminology you're talking about, does that just replace 1.5?
Well, actually, for us, it becomes number 6.
Yeah.
So, but yes, that would be the modification to 1.5, what is currently 1.5.
Victoria, I would feel more comfortable
Yes.
if you would put in under this.
Yes?
It's critically important, fences, walls, and lighting, and also, privacy and views.
I agree. I think those are the key. So I'm making notes. This is Doug had said fences, walls, and lighting goes under here. I don't think there were any
Yeah.
disagreements with that. But this is the bullet point thing and the reference and the hyperlinking,
Yeah.
not about the principal bolded part at all, which was what we're concentrating on. Nori, were you about to say something?
No,
Okay. You looked contemplative there.
no.
Okay.
So do we agree with that, though, what Doug suggested?
Yes.
And what I suggested
I
about privacy
agree.
and
I don't think
views?
there are any disagreements, that structures including fences and stuff, and then you're saying privacy, views, lights,
Yeah.
and air relates, of course.
Yes.
Totally agree. I think that gets
Okay.
fleshed out, but personally, I feel more satisfied that we've differentiated this from the overall context of Carmel
Right.
and brought it down one level of scale. So that's good. And I do think that's what Nori was after. Okay, so pay attention to detail. This is now another level of scale. So I think we are continuing our funnel, which is probably good. Pay attention to, if I channel Marianne a little bit and my own self, I want it to be a stronger verb. What could we say? So this, to me, goes to the detail, to the craft. Nori's already got
Yes.
that. Excellence and authenticity in materials and design. Craft, detail. How, besides paying attention, is there a stronger way to have that a principle? It's like, if I was channeling my architectural education, it would be something along the lines maybe of, all the details need to reinforce the concept of the building, or that, the details have to, and it's more like a part of the bullet points here maybe, that all details must contribute to the authenticity of the style or to the architecture. Or Don, let's hear from you, the other architect currently here.
I'm trying to figure out how to keep this simple. I'm afraid we're expanding it. In fact, I'm going to go way back to the beginning. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
But I find 2 and 3 duplicative, and 3 can be part of 2, but I think to keep stating the same thing in different versions is just weakening it.
Okay, so I take that point. So subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment, and subordinating each project to the natural features of the site are
that's
so close to one another
thought.
that they could be one thought.
Yes.
So let's put a pin on that. I think the simpler the better. But
Right, now when we get into this detailed business,
okay.
is that just going to create another category, and rather than keeping it simple to one concept, pay attention to detail? I don't know.
So, let me ask you this question as an architect, Don. Why do we pay attention to detail? What is important about paying attention to detail? Can we capture that in a sentence? When I look at your house, it's a Gesamtkunstwerk, right? Does everybody know what that means? It's a work that works all together. Every piece contributes to the whole. That, I know Marianne would, if she were sitting here, might say something like, you can't get people to do good design. They have to be good designers to do good design. But obviously, we're going to try.
Yes.
And I think that we think, and that Nori thinks, and you'll tell me otherwise, and Brandon thinks, that every building should be consistent in itself, and the details should reinforce the overall concept of the building, right? Otherwise,
Right.
they feel like that building that Marianne was pointing to, that you asked her which building, are you talking about the one across from the
Yeah, it's
The hotel.
the one you love, Marianne loves, and I love. It's a disaster.
Right. It's a disaster because it's a hodgepodge.
Yes.
So this is about avoiding a hodgepodge, right? Isn't it? So how do we... but they
the
paid attention.
details-
Marianne would say they paid attention to detail, but in the wrong way. So how do we tweak this a little bit so that it's really describes how important detail is and why we pay attention to it in the bolded part itself?
Right. I think that's what authenticity gets to. You know, we haven't stressed authenticity that much. We have constantly here talked about creativity and authenticity. And when we're talking about styles, you know, we don't want an excess of inappropriate details. Like building forms that are unnecessary and overly flamboyant or for the style of the house, uncharacteristic of the style of the house.
So it's like details must reinforce the building concept.
And avoid any extraneous stuff.
They must, okay, we want to, So, go
let
ahead,
me-
Nori, please.
You know,
jump in.
there, in earlier discussions, in talking about detail, you guys mentioned 3 things that we're planning on addressing when we get into the details of the guidelines related to this. And so one is this idea of consistency.
Right, exactly.
Another is the quality of the details and the depth of them, and particularly when you were referencing things like window trim that's very thin and doesn't really provide shadow lines or a sense of scale. So detail also has to do with that, providing scale, providing a sense of durability and high quality, as well as consistency. So that's what I was trying to capture here. And then that will all, of course, be expanded on in the guidelines that follow.
So consistency is a good word, I think, yeah? I mean.
Yeah, consistency in design.
So the question is, you know, and again, I agree with Don, we may end up with 6 principles in the end of this, or 5. I mean, who
Yeah,
knows?
yeah.
We can maybe really simplify this, but each thing, in my view, should be a standalone phrase that really has meat to it. So maybe we have to figure out a way. So Nori's pointing out consistency and sort of quality or substance.
What about,
Yeah.
so I'm just looking at these other ones that are, the other principles that are, you know, they're active, they're directive, you know, keep, respect. These are do words. So pay attention, I think. So what if this one started with design with, and then fill in the blank there, design with attention to detail, design with authentic details. You guys fill in the blank there,
Right.
but maybe that's where you start is when
An
you're
active
designing,
verb.
that's the action, is design with, and then, you know, fill in the blank.
That's very good, Brandon.
So it's design all structures or something with something like quality details that reinforce or are consistent with the overall project or something like that?
Yeah, overall design of the project.
Do you see, Don, where we're headed here?
No, what did you say?
That are consistent with the overall design of the project.
So,
That they're authentic and consistent with the overall design, not just something that's tacked on, something that's not, as Nori says, authentic.
also the word detail is a verb. Detail all project, I mean, just throwing that out there. Detail all projects with a high level of craft and consistency, something like that. You could do that, because detail is also a verb.
That work?
I think what Nori said, design with, and then, you know, a couple of bullet points, 3 bullet points, I think what we're concerned about is if we take the house across from La Playa, there's
house.
nothing consistent.
Right.
I mean, except bad detailing. I mean, and of course, the landscaping is a disaster. But I think that one thing that strikes me as I look at some of the new houses that are being built, one in particular that's on Carmelo, it has these totally unnecessary roof lines. And the color is an issue, and then the detailing is it's overdone. It's the simplicity that it could have, it doesn't achieve because of the unnecessary roof form and just the whole way they've put it together. So things ought to be integrated, they need to be consistent, and we can have creativity and we must have authenticity. If they pick a kind of craftsman style, it should read as a craftsman style, not a hyphenated, hyper designed craftsman. The beauty of craftsmanship is its simplicity, its modesty, and when all of the forms come together in a truly recognizable historic design.
Mm-hmm.
So, Madam Chair, as I'm
Yes.
hearing Melanie talk, I just wrote something down, and I think you guys, this is maybe start the conversation, but I wrote down design with authentic and consistent detail. I mean,
And
that,
That works.
Really says it, you know.
Design with say it again?
design with authentic and consistent detail. And I think that that doesn't limit you, because it's authentic to what you're trying to do, whether it's you know, Tudor style house, mid-century modern, craftsman, whatever, authenticity of that design, and it's consistent throughout the whole project. And then the sub-bullets get into more of the detail.
Yeah.
I like it, and I'm only wondering about craft. Does craft captured by that? Do you think like high level of craft? Authentic is probably captures that. Do we think?
Just put it as a bullet point underneath.
Yeah, yeah,
there.
yeah.
Don't get the main sentence.
So
Right,
you've got your
right.
second bullet already has well-crafted work. And
Okay.
Yes, I think you're
So
covered there.
design with authentic and consistent details. Now, does consistent need authentic details that are consistent with the project? Do you know what I mean? Like with the entire project? Do we have to, what does it mean to be consistent? Is it consistent with one another or with the entire project? I think that might maybe need to add that way. So design with authentic details that are consistent with the overall project? See what I mean?
Mhm. That's sort of what I was going for there.
Yeah,
And
I think the idea that you mentioned, Brandon, is good. A design with authentic and consistent details or detailing.
And we could use, you know, one of the sub bullets to explain that, Madam Chair, that consistent means consistency throughout an entire project.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want people, for example, here's this crazy example. Let's imagine a Tudor building that has consistent mission style detailing all over it. Do you see what I'm saying? The details are consistent with one another, but they're not consistent with the project. I'm not saying people are that off, but it could happen. So I just want to
Yeah.
make clear somehow that we're talking about and Melanie used the word integrated.
Yes.
So I like that word a lot too. And again, maybe that appears. Okay. So what I have now is 6 principles. If we go back to Don's last minute rogue edit of 2 and 3 as possibly being 1. So what last week was 1, 2, 3 might be 1, 2. And that would renumber everything, and we would have half a dozen principles, which is quite nice. If you can do it, we'll
So
see.
this changes all of our numbering.
It changes the numbering. But let's think, since Don brought it up, about 2 and 3, and how we could combine them nicely if we want to do that. And it's true, we had a lot of principles about landscape, and maybe it's silly to have so many when, you got to
No.
move on at some point.
No, I think.
In terms of quantity, we want quality, right?
Yes.
So we have highlighted restore and enhance the forests in all improvement projects, private, public, and otherwise.
You're gonna have to excuse me a minute.
Oh, please. See you soon. And then 2 and 3 are about subordination. So that's what they have in common. Subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment. 3, subordinate each project to the natural features of its site.
All you have to add is to the and also to the natural features of the site, to item 2.
Yeah, so maybe, we just take out 3, the first half of 3, subordinate each project. So
Yeah.
subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment and to the natural features of its site.
Exactly.
Yes? Done and done? Okay. Of its own site. I feel like I keep forgetting. I think own is good because it's like we're not just talking
Okay,
about the
you're right.
site
Right.
of Carmel. Okay. So that makes that principle number 2. Oh, yes, sorry. You ready? Subordinate all built work to the character of the forest and natural environment. Oh, sorry, it would be forest, comma, natural environment, comma, because I like my Oxford commas, and to the natural features of its own site. Now this says all built work. Is that singular or plural? Because it's its own site. All built work, its own site. Built work is a single, right? Built work? Okay. So that's good. All right, so that's principle 2. Then what was principle 4, keep all buildings modest and simple, would now be 3, as it is now, point 3. So we're actually getting back to the existing numbering if you ignore the decimal point in a way. So 4 would be retain and build upon Carmel's official architectural heritage. That's 4. 5 is fit every structure within its neighborhood context. And 6 is something along the lines of design. Oh, wait a minute. I wrote over it. Here's, you remember what you have, Brandon, because I had written over design with authentic details that are consistent with the overall project, but you had it faster.
I think where we landed was design with authentic and consistent details.
Okay, design with authentic and consistent details. Okay. That's the dirty half dozen. So anything that comes to mind, it's 10 o'clock, that we have not handled with this kind of umbrella category, because I think these are very nice high-level categories of thinking about projects. Nori, are you still with us? You think you are? Melanie, my question just now was, we've got these 6 now, because what we did, and maybe when you were out of the room, is we combined 2 and 3 per Don's suggestion.
Yeah.
It now reads, subordinate all built work to the character of the forest, comma, the natural environment, comma, and to the natural features of its own site. Pretty easy fix.
What happened to 7?
Well, 7 is, so that by eliminating 3, we moved all the numbers up. So 7 is now 6.
Oh, 7 is still there?
Oh, sorry, compatible diversity did not make the cut, Don. You said you were going to be flexible. That is now going to be
We don't think
somewhere
that's
under
important?
historic precedence or context, according to the majority here.
Is that covered? Okay.
It's going to be covered elsewhere. In terms of a principle people need to think about at the very top of mind and remember, hopefully, wouldn't it be nice if we could memorize these, if we could really have conversations based on 6 principles. Any other thoughts, though? The question as you came in for the group was, have we missed anything? Have we missed a category of thinking about design in Carmel that we really need to, that's at this kind of high level, that can't be taken care of in a bullet or a chapter, that's a principle? And I'm just going to skim the outline a little bit. And Nori, I wanted to ask you that also, but I don't know if you're online anymore. Oh, no, I hear you. There you're coming back.
There he is.
Nori, what do you think? Can you think of anything else that's come up? And we can just test it. It could be like just a question, not really, don't think it really is that rises to the level, but let's just try it on for size for a second. You know, something we might have missed that's come up in all these conversations that's around the same scale of these comments.
No, I mean, when I drafted these, I tried to really work a lot with all of the notes from all the different levels of input. I will say that after this, I do want to go back and review the handbook responses. There were a few suggested word tweaks that people provided, and in some cases they particularly put a star by a certain principle as they thought was highly valued. So I just want to let you know I will want to cross-check to be certain that we've picked up those ideas as well.
And here's another thing I'll say is that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think this covers it.
This covers it. So, and when I look through your outline, I feel like there's some really important words here, like the word nestled is a wonderful word.
Yes.
It doesn't need to be in the bold print, but maybe, again, as you do your cross-check, Nori, and we can try to help you with this if we have time in the schedule, but like all the really good stuff, see if it can be, again, fit into one of the half dozen. So when people are, because I don't want to lose any of these words that are so beautiful, like informal and walkable. That seems to me has to do a little bit with the neighborhood, maybe.
Right.
Or
The whole community.
yeah, so where can we draw on the rest of this document and reinforce these 6 really in the most kind of accessible way possible, I guess is what I'm wondering. And I would say the same thing for the chapters. Like, I feel like there is a way in which, and I know maybe you're saying it's too hard, Nori, but just if you wouldn't mind, as you're going through this, thinking about, like, really, is there a correspondence in scale? And I think this is a question for you, staff, too, for Brandon. What is the most important way to access this document? Because, again, there is a bewilderment here factor that is just pervasive. Sadly, Nori, really, this is the reaction. This is why we're here, is that we have this beautiful document that covers everything if you dig deep enough, but nobody does.
Well, I've been, I can answer this. I've been trying my best over the last 2 years to drag the city operation into the 20th century, and eventually we'll get into the 21st century, but I'm trying to get into the 20th century first. So I think technology is, for me, one of the paramount ways we get people to access this document. We're talking about these hyperlinks. It's going to be on our website. We have technology when people show up that we can have them up on a screen at our front desk now. So for me, that's the big one. A lot of these things we're talking about, having these quick references between different sections, only are capable in technology. If you have a paper copy in front of you, it just doesn't work.
Right.
Some people are going to want to work from paper, but for me, that's the way we get to the win here, is we make sure that people know this is going to be an online electronic document that they're going to be using.
And then let's talk briefly, because Nori brought it up, about again, without the benefit of that technology in the old days, this is not even, as you know, Nori, it's been incredibly frustrating to so many of us who are in the 21st century to not be able to search this document. I mean, that's insane in some ways, right? Because that's the type of PDF it is.
Yeah.
And that's just an old document type. So when we look through the structure, the outline of this, which is what the whole premise of this continued meeting is about, as a point of entry to this document is the sequence of what you do when you're building a project, the proper chronology for organizing, as a question to staff? Or, again, is it possibly, I know I'm supposed to keep it modest, how do I do that? I don't know. Or what other things?
It's a good question. I think we'll continue to think about that. And I think
Yeah.
some of these tools we're talking about, like the checklist, it helps with that.
Right.
It gets people thinking about it the minute they walk in with a project. Versus now the way it's set up is sometimes unless someone has taken the time to go through the guidelines all the way to the end, some things they don't see until the final details review. Because right now it's 2 separate books essentially. So
Right.
one of the reasons, formatting wise, we're talking about combining them into one book. So at least
Right.
they're in the same document now.
Right.
So I do think, just all the stuff that we've talked about in this group and with the community and stuff that we've talked about internally, we've learned, I do think we're really poised to create a much more usable document, just purely by the way that it's formatted and structured. And then anything else we do on top of that is basically gravy. I think just makes it even more useful for people. So that's a great question to think about, the arc, how it lines up with the actual development process. So we'll continue to think about that.
I mean, it really is a genuine question I have, because I do think this work we're doing as a group right now with Nori and Brandon and the whole group to have memorable phrases that can organize conversations even, and we, you know, Nori, you probably saw this in some of the notes, there were a lot of realtors in attendance, not a lot, but a handful of realtors in some of these meetings, and they are often the first point of contact.
Absolutely.
I can sort of have this vision now after this work that they might have a little piece of a card with the 6 principles on it, and a link, and a URL that says, here, by the way, you're getting into something here when you
So when
come
they get
here.
their 6% check, they hand them a card back and says, here's your.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe the checklist isn't the 6, maybe it's 6 times 3 because there are 3 subsets to each of the 6. Maybe it's 18. I don't know. But I do want this to be a very. I think the feedback has been. It's not that there's anything wrong with the design guidelines. This is the 0.5 aspect of it. It's that it's not usable. We really have to think about why it has been failed to be exploited to the hilt as it should have been always. And I think ordering the order of things, the way you conceptualize the outline, this is very much part of this. I'm seeing a nod from Melanie and Doug, and Don is very contemplative.
And Brandon.
And Brandon.
No, this definitely has to be
I'm not sure.
user-friendly.
Tell me what you're thinking, Don.
All this phraseology we're working on, where does that show up? You see, that's
That's
where
what we don't know. That's what we don't know. If we're talking now about maybe it's what the realtors were asking for, a card. Maybe it's part of maybe it's the organizing of the checklist that.
Checklist is a word that you
Yeah.
talked about, which I think is
Yeah.
of the essence.
Yes.
So where's the checklist?
The checklist. So for example.
This is a checklist?
It could be the checklist, or it could be the headings of the checklist. The checklist could have 2 or 3 things under each of these principles. So, did you restore and enhance the forest and all improvement projects? Yes, I planted 6 trees that were, how many trees did you plant? Whatever, I don't know. I'm just.
But I think, if I could, I think one of the reasons, maybe part of the wisdom behind council saying, these ideas like the checklist and things like that, moving them to a work plan that we agree on at the end of, like, when we're sitting together in June and these guidelines get adopted and we're all celebrating, we're not done. We're going to have a work plan of things like this checklist, and some of them are going to be like, do it in the next month. It'll be easy to do once the guidelines are all done, because then you'll know the whole document. Right now, if we tried to write a checklist, we would undoubtedly miss a couple things that we're going to come up with in the next couple months. So some of those things are timing, but I feel really strongly and actually kind of excited about the work plan idea, because it means that once we have this document that's adopted, we have some more, I think, kind of fun things to do to really hone it in and make it more useful. So the document won't change, but how it gets implemented, we're going to create little tools for it.
Well, I like that very much, and I guess my only call is that, Nori knows this is coming, and it may or may not be overlapping much with the end of your time with us, Nori, but just to have that a little bit anticipatory thinking as we are at the outline level of, like, if there's going to be a checklist, if we have these 6 principles that we really like that are standalone, how can the outline now be tweaked to anticipate some of these other documents that we will want to have, whether they are flow charts about who you talk to first when you move to town, or whether they are checklists that Councilmember Barron has said so many times, we're going to try to put that responsibility onto the applicant so that we're partners with the applicant, not just telling them what to do. All the tools we're going to develop later, it would be nice if the guidelines were anticipating some of that in terms of their structure, not their content so much, which is already being enhanced and through all these exercises and all the illustrations and everything, but the actual structure.
Yeah, well, I can speak. So Nori and I have had conversations about that, so we are thinking about that for sure. Yep.
And maybe you can report back to us as you kind of have ideas about that. Since we now, I think our timing is good today. We like our 6. I think Nori likes them. I know he's not objecting vehemently to them. They're not that different from what he started out with.
Well, I would suggest, Madam Chair, absolutely. And I think as we continue to have these meetings, the steering committee meetings, if you all come up with something and someone says, that's a good idea, just say, put it on the work plan. Like, that's going to be helpful for me if you all come up with something like that we haven't talked about yet. Obviously, the checklist, all that stuff's already there, so we don't have to say that. But if over the next few months, if we come up with something that we all think is like, hey, this is a really good idea, let's just say put it on the work plan, and we're keeping track of that stuff.
Awesome. So we do have 15 minutes, which is a good amount of time to get to, unless there are any final comments. I think this was really good work.
Can
yes,
we add,
Melanie, we're going to get to the future agenda items. Go ahead. Weigh in.
Can we add parking and access to our key design factors
So you're saying
in number 6?
Yes. So you're saying the neighborhood one,
Yes, just add parking and
I was
access.
kind of teasing is sort of the catch-all for the whole friggin' document. That there are certain things that really do relate to the neighborhood in your mind, and parking and access might be one of them.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Could I actually
Yeah.
interject on that one,
Yes.
just from a planner's perspective? So there's a lot going on in the world of parking
Yeah.
these days with respect to housing and cities removing parking requirements. For example, San Jose just citywide got rid of all requirements for parking. They're arguably the most overparked city in the United States, and it was a groundbreaking regulation they did to completely get rid of parking. I don't know where we're going to be going with housing and parking in the future, but I would suggest as a guiding principle, maybe not to put parking in there. Just knowing where planning might go in the future. We can put it down in the regulations of some sort, but I think it might be unwise to put parking at a high level.
Well, I don't think she was saying that. I think she was just saying as a sub bullet
right,
point
just on
to
our
list.
list.
With the
Our
neighborhood context
Because if
as a
we're-
design matter.
If we're
Okay.
talking about changing the right-of-way, and if we're talking about ADUs, and we're doing all of this, where the heck are these people gonna go that have 2 cars?
Well,
What is-
a good
what is our
example,
streetscape?
sorry.
And in the early years of this community, they didn't want parking on the street. They wanted parking on the property. You have a parking pad, you have a carport, or you have a garage. And with the small lots that we have here, it directly impacts the neighborhood. I cannot understand how we can possibly not address parking, even if we think that at some point we might do something more innovative. If eliminating parking requirements is innovative, I'm not sure about that, not in this town. They didn't want cars cluttering the natural environment. Well, guess what we've got in this town? So
I think that is a very important topic that maybe we have to agendize as like a sort of a discussion point, because obviously parking is not the same as restoring and enhancing the forest. It's related to that.
yeah,
So, but we haven't talked about it very much yet, and maybe that's something, and you guys could update us on what you're thinking and these things you're anticipating that could change, and just we could have at least schedule a topic.
Yeah,
Sure.
about
Yeah,
it.
we talk. I mean, one of the I didn't mean to interrupt you, Melanie. I'm sorry, but one of the things I was going to say, even the comment about ADUs. Well, that's already off the table. ADUs, we can't require parking. We can't even talk about parking with an
no,
ADU.
but it affects the parking.
I understand that, but we-
Parking itself.
Yeah.
If everyone's converting garages and whatnot to ADUs, well, what about our long-term vision of, not
forest.
having this community, just cluttered with parking? I mean, whether it's a downtown or whether it's in the residential district, not every, maybe neighborhood is affected by it, but the ones that are affected by it, we have to,
Yeah.
we absolutely have to think about this.
So I think it's not going to be part of the half dozen principles, because we can't possibly pin it down like that.
Just
But
in
let's-
this list of,
Yeah.
of key design factors,
Key
building
design factors,
size.
yes, of
yeah,
course, of
and all
course.
of that. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, totally makes sense, and I think it's also, that does, I think, dovetail into the future agenda items. Brandon had mentioned to me yesterday that Nori and Brandon are ready to move right into the bulk plane presentation,
That's excellent.
but we
News.
don't know if we have Mary Ann, who now already left. Thank you. So that's a
Thank you.
question. I wish, I mean, maybe I could text her, or do you want to text her, Brandon, during the meeting? And just see, like, is there any chance, I don't know if she'll pick up or respond, but in terms of the rest of us, I
So-
was told, Brandon told me yesterday that Brandon and Nori are available before the Christmas holidays, sometime this week or next week, at the beginning of the week, I imagine, to give us the bulk plane overview, what that is and how it might apply to all the districts, the ADU issue, the downtown, et cetera. Are four of us at least available one more time before the holidays?
I am.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's room in the calendar.
Okay, I'll work with Mary Ann. And so if I could just really quickly, what I just handed out to you all here. So Nori and I sat down this week, after the meeting with City Council and getting the direction that, June is the adoption time, we're gonna stay on that track. So we laid out the things that we need from this committee along the way. These are like milestone topics that we're gonna need feedback from this committee on. So you can see what's out here, as the chair just said, we're working on the outline. We just finished that, which was great. The next thing we're going to need feedback on is the bulk plane, because as I mentioned, Nori and his team is already working on updates to these guidelines. So they're in it right now, and some of these bigger topics like the bulk plane, we want to make sure we get the feedback before we go too far down that road. So you can see then we'll be back in January to talk about the landscaping ordinance. I'm working right now on getting a contractor on board. And then we get into the actual drafts for the committee to review. Then we want to have a conversation as we turn towards writing the zoning code sections that relate to the design guidelines, talking about the design review board and the structure. Then we start planning for that community workshop number 3 in March. And then we're going to have the second draft of guidelines and the zoning code, and that gets us to June. So there may be some topics, like the chair just mentioned, parking is something we want to put on as a subtopic, but for the work that's happening on the actual guidelines and the contract that we're under with Nori, these are the things that I'll be bringing to you over the next six plus or minus months. So these are imperatives that have to happen. These are the milestones, the critical path items that have to happen. And I've put dates or at least months next to them so you can kind of expect when they're coming. Again, this is just for everyone's information, but yeah, we'd like to talk to you all in this month before we go on holiday break. So the city closes on the 23rd, and we don't come back until the 3rd. So we'd love to meet with you all. So I'll talk to Mary Ann. It sounds like everyone else is available before the holiday break. So we'll work something out.
And if some of us can't make it, we still have to move forward, maybe Zoom or by phone or whatever.
Yeah, and we record all these, so if worst case scenario, Melanie, you're right, like one of the members could just watch the video and see what happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
So let me add then, and I want everyone else to chime in as well. Here we have the sort of key inflection points for the staff and Nori on the handout. Just things I've noted in the last cycle here that folks have brought up they want to address that may not be quite at the same milestone level, but the downtown streetscape is, I think, the bulk plane discussion. It will be incorporated in that. That's one thing I had noted from other conversations. Retention strategies of old buildings. That was something that has come up now a couple times recently. It could be, we have talked about it a little bit today, even with the principals, but it might be worth a subtopic or just a quick maybe explanation later when you've had time to prep, Brandon, on what we could do to strengthen that, how that might fit in somewhere as a subtopic in the design guidelines, even stuff that Mary Ann said today about linking to other documents, maybe that's, but.
Well, I would say that topic, because you're talking about making someone do something, that's probably more of a zoning code thing.
Yeah.
So that would be, the timing would work with later, because we're going to be talking about zoning code stuff more in the January, February timeline.
So retention of existing buildings you think is more there?
I think that's more of a regulatory thing than a design thing.
Okay, that's true. I think that's true. Okay, so you're saying that belongs more in the draft zoning code of February?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Retention existing. Okay, and then there was the informational catch-up that Brandon, you had talked to Doug and me about at one point, like just wanting to report out about the different documents and things that are going on with the consultant team and the staff that we haven't really had a presentation about recently. I think that would be a useful like intro to a meeting maybe. Maybe don't have time for it on the bulk plane conversation, but maybe the next one.
That would be a nice way possibly to start the new year.
The new year,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
So this is going to be a New Year's thing, maybe, if everybody agrees with that.
Bulk plane?
No, the bulk plane we're going to try to do before. The kind
Yeah.
of catch up of all the
Oh,
behind
okay.
the scenes, like
Okay.
documents that are underway and the processes and stuff that Brandon has been saying he owes us. And then I just added parking. Where do we
Where?
see that? I mean, maybe that's is that a landscape ordinance possible thing, or what do you think?
Well, if we're
As a place to
talking,
put
it's
it?
part of the ROW.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
maybe that's it. Maybe
That'd be good, because the feedback we're going to be looking for there is, high-level goals, suggested approaches. What does a successful landscape ordinance look like when paired with the guidelines? So it's dealing with the right-of-way area, which definitely dovetails with parking. So.
Okay, so maybe we make sure we put a pin in the parking topic as something to discuss as a focused topic during the landscape design overview. Does that make sense? And then I didn't mean for that to be exhaustive. This is just notes I've taken recently. Does anyone have any other lingering topics that we want to sort of catch up on and add to the really the milestone topics here?
I'm
Doug?
glad to see that we've got January and February for Design Review Board.
Design Review Board is one. Any other things in your memory bank?
About compounds.
Compounds.
We talked a lot today about the streetscape, and
Right.
that has a huge potential impact on our streetscapes.
Yes, how does that fit into this work plan, Brandon? Because is that regulatory? Is that a zoning
Could
code
be,
issue?
I was just gonna say, definitely we could look at the zoning code. But one thing that's important is people could be tying on to this whole idea is that in the past, the city has looked forward to trying to get people to have bigger lots. So that there's diversity in lot sizes. So so everything in this town isn't a cookie cutter size. So I think that your idea of discussing this is extremely important. I mean, because I think you could successfully, like Mary Ann said, achieve what is in reality a compound, but you don't have to have it all walled off, and you have variables of detailing within whatever is being planned, so that there's not just looking like a compound that we would think about is maybe being in a very wealthy neighborhood where you would have like a mother's house and a mother-in-law house and a guest house, and having the main house. I'm just pulling it out. I just think that having variable sized lots is extremely important in town, but we just don't want to have walls and compound like fences loaded with ivy that are not open and pedestrian welcoming.
So do you agree, Melanie, that is primarily a zoning code issue in terms of lot size?
Well,
or that we could discuss it under that bullet?
Yeah,
in February?
I guess so. I mean, but I would think that I haven't looked at the zoning code lately. Brandon, what are we saying? How are we implementing the long-standing policy of wanting variable sized lots in a neighborhood so that everything isn't like cookie cutter that's,
Yeah, our zoning code, we still have the bonuses. So there's bonuses you get for merging lots, you know, extra site coverage,
you know,
things
then
like that.
see, we have to really address that.
So let's put that, I mean, compounds and lot sizes,
Yeah.
I mean, that's on for February. Before we lose you, Brandon, I've got one other thing. I've just now flipped back through my agenda, my notes from other meetings. Material standards.
Oh, yes.
Faux materials.
Oh,
We
yes.
cannot forget that one. And I don't see a logical place for it here, so we're gonna have to carve out something somewhere. It's not landscape, it's certainly not bulk plain. How do we address the standards for authenticity? We did phrase that nicely today with the details and authenticity.
Well, it could just, I mean, when we get to January, you're going to have a red line version of the guidelines. So there's going to be a discussion in there already about materials, so that could be one of the things we focus on when going through the actual red lines of the guidelines.
Okay, well, I'm gonna call it out because weirdly, it's just been one of those floating topics that we keep push forward over again, and it has, it doesn't have, we haven't even had a discussion about, you know, how would we shift our thinking about a way to approach this discussion. It has always been a tough one for this town because its little ground is shifting a little bit, but there are actually objective standards for these things that maybe, again, talk about hyperlinks
Yeah.
and things, maybe out there somewhere, but it's a little bit of a bigger discussion because it requires a little more work than some of the other guidelines that have been working well when you know about them. This one doesn't work well yet.
No.
So, okay, let's put that on then for January. But we cannot forget to make a sort of special highlight of that.
I think it'll be easier too when you have a set of red lines as a sort of like a place to start a conversation. Say this works or doesn't work, here's what we need to add, rather than just trying to spitball out with nothing in front of us.
Okay, so anything else that anyone can remember? Like I said, I just went through all the notes I've taken.
And you can each of you individually can feel free to email me if you think of something, and I can try to figure out how we work it into this schedule too.
Thank you for laying out this long-term thing for us, Brandon and
bet.
Nori. And thank you for
Yes.
joining us, Nori, for this whole thing.
Sure.
I'm glad you were available the whole time.
And glad you're getting
Thanks,
better.
Lori. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, happy
We may see you
holidays.
again before the
Yes.
holidays.
Get well.
Yeah.
We don't know. It looks like, I can't tell if Neil is clapping.
I think he's clapping.
Okay.
Although that is how he raised his hand earlier. Neil, were you trying to say
Neil,
something,
yeah,
or are you
let's-
just clapping?
Is there public
Yes.
comment? Go ahead, Neil.
Just wanted to say something. First of all, I want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing. This is a really big job, really complicated, and nice to hear about making it. I really understand Victoria's efforts to make this available to everybody in the simplest way possible. Loving that kind of conversation. I just have one little thought, you guys, that this is so complex. The actual writing of the design guidelines themselves, we have an expert here that's worked with I don't know how many cities and how many counties. That maybe if we could give him the freedom to hear our concerns, to hear our emphasis, to hear our priorities, but let him actually put the document together using his expertise and then present it to us, and at that time then begin to talk about how we want to reassemble it or emphasize it and so on and so forth. I know that with somebody with his knowledge, he's going to know things that we don't even know about that happens in this kind of a process. I don't want to remove his expertise in putting together the design guidelines.
Are you talking about Nori here or some other consultant? I'm sorry, I didn't follow.
Nori went.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Nori, yes, we
I'm
have
talking
Nori.
about Nori.
Yes, we're
Yeah.
lucky to have Nori.
I think that's basically the process.
Yes, I think that's where we're headed, Neil. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody,
everyone.
meeting adjourned?
See you next
Yes,
week.
unless I think,
See you
yes,
next
see you
week.
shortly. See you shortly, Nori.
I think, when we're planning this, I really think honestly, we should try to do